Oh,
Maoilearca.
Mel.
Maoilearca.
Yeah.
Okay, Maoilearca. Now I have an approximation.
Okay. Okay, we are live.
Great.
We can start.
Thanks a lot for making this all work so well. I'm happy to moderate tonight's session. It's the third of our promotional seminars of the School for Materialist Research, and I'm very excited and happy to welcome John Maoilearca as our third speaker with a paper entitled Matter, the Meta-Spiritual and the Forgotten Bergson. I will just briefly give an introduction to John, and then we will hear his paper, which is going to last approximately 50 minutes, and then we will have time, a good half an hour, depending on how lively our discussion is going to be, to talk about what we hear. So John is professor at the Department of Critical and Historical Studies at Kingston University, London. He has previously lectured in philosophy departments at the University of Sunderland, England, and the University of Dundee in Scotland. He has published 11 books, including as an author, Bergson and Philosophy in 2000, Post-Continental Philosophy, an Outline, 2006, Philosophy and the Moving Image, Refractions of Reality in 2010, and All Thoughts Are Equal, Laruelle and Non-Human Philosophy in 2015. He works in the areas of continental philosophy, specifically with Bergson, Deleuze, Henri, Laruelle, and Badiou, metaphysics, especially of time and identity, and metaphilosophy. The latter has led him to explore non-standard modes of thinking and philosophical expression, including the diagrammatic thinking, animal representation, as well as film philosophy. Recently, he has directed his interest towards François Laruelle's project of non-philosophy. And currently he's working on ordinary modes of mysticism and so-called mental time travel. I'm very happy to welcome you, John. And perhaps I forgot to say who I am. My name is Vera Billmann. I'm directing the Department for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Techniques at Vienna University of Technology. So the floor is yours, John. Very welcome.
Thank you very much, Vera. I hope you can all hear me, and I don't drift out of, with my blurred background, drift out of focus visually as well as conceptually too much in the next 50 minutes. And thank you to Zachary and all those at the School of Materialist Research setting this up, and Katerina for the invitation, which is very nice to receive. So yes, I'm afraid I had a materialist intervention earlier when my car battery failed. The chemicals just refused to work anymore, and that left me with a dead car and me running around trying to get here. And so these are the kind of little panic moments you like to have before you get the paper. And I wasn't able to produce a proper presentation in terms of a PowerPoint. So it's mostly just me banging on and then some quotations just to ease you through the pain of my voice. So it's in 3 parts, you might say. Part 1, 2, and a conclusion. And it's kind of tour of some thoughts I've had about material philosophy, materialism as well, and the material of philosophy over the years, and then engaging with my current research on mysticism as a model of knowledge, an alternative form of non-standard philosophy. Okay, so hope this works well for you. So philosophers these days, it's a terrible phrase these days, but I couldn't think of anything else. Philosophers these days, like many, no doubt, like to feel that they are relevant, that they have a role in the world. And there are exceptions, of course. Sometimes one likes to kind of indulge in irrelevance as well. And certainly the seemingly interminable interest in Deleuze and post-Deleuzian theory, in continental circuits at least, or interest in Alain Badiou, Catherine Malabou, Helen Barad, for instance, is partly related to their positive engagement with both the sciences and politics, worldly ideas. It is reassuring to see philosophy thinking with Leibniz and embryology and political resistance movements, or Plato and set theory and militant insurgency. Philosophy has taken the immanent turn and come back down to earth from the seemingly inconsequential heavens of transcendence. Immanence means relevance, even when that relevance comes through the abstractions of mathematics, such as Alain Badiou's work. As David Papineau put it once upon a time, quote, nearly everybody nowadays wants to be he didn't use the word immanent, he used the word naturalist. Everybody nowadays wants to be a naturalist, unquote. And everybody wants their ontology to be a political ontology too, so it seems. But things are never so simple, alas. For, as Papineau continues, quote, the aspirants to the term naturalism nevertheless disagree wildly on substantial questions of philosophical doctrine, unquote. Evidently then, nature and naturalism is an infuriatingly ambiguous set of terms. Indeed, Raymond Williams famously goes so far as to suggest that nature is the most complex word in the English language. Which is why Henri Bergson, to make a swift shift, has this, I think, to write about all monisms, naturalist or idealist, materialist or spiritualist, even you might say immanentist or transcendentalist. Namely, monisms that say one thing about every single thing. Here's, for some people, a well-known quote, perhaps. Quote, to place will everywhere is the same as leaving it nowhere. It makes little difference to me if one says everything is mechanism or everything is will. In either case, everything is identical. In both cases, mechanism and will become synonyms of each other. Therein lies the initial vice of philosophical systems. They think they are telling us something about the absolute by giving it a name. But the more you increase the extension of the term, the more you diminish comprehension of it. If you include matter within its extension, you empty its comprehension of the positive characteristics by which spontaneity stands out against mechanism and liberty against necessity. When finally the word arrives at the point where it designates everything that exists, it means no more than existence. What advantage is there than in saying that the world is will, instead of simply saying that it is? Okay. So one name will never be sufficient. You just have to extend it until basically it becomes vacuous, if it's going to be part of an all-embracing monistic system. As a minimum, it seems, we need a dyad, a meta-philosophical dualysis. Or, and this is citing from an older paper of mine on this topic, or as the Benny Goodman song, those of you who like light jazz, Benny Goodman song goes, it's got to be this or that. We need a duality, not of substance, but of thought, in order to explain anything, even when what they explain, or is being explained, is uniform, a monism, the one or the real. Bergsonism has been described, therefore, quite rightly, as a dynamic monism, a philosophy that is both dualist and unitary, dualizing tendencies over dualistic states. It's about tendency, not state. Indeed, Bergson's process philosophy cannot be separated from questions of metaphilosophy. From the Bergsonian perspective, indeed, metaphilosophy, as its etymology would suggest, simply means change in philosophy. No less than a process metaphysics designates change and transformation in physis, so metaphilosophy designates the transformation of philosophia. But we must be mindful not to think of this as the documentary trace of such changes. That would simply be the history of philosophy, history of ideas, so much as the change itself, what Bergson regards as the necessary movement of thought, or as he also called it, thinking in duration. Another shift in gear then. In her essay, Catherine Malabou's essay, Before and After, Spinoza and Symbolic Necessity, she examines the sacred through what she calls an experience of overreading. For Spinoza, she writes, the mind, and here's the quote, has a natural tendency to over-interpret, and such is the origin, very possibility of the sacred. For Spinoza, to overread or over-interpret means to confer semantic content on a word or phrase by inflating its absence of referent. In other words, extending it, what Bergson was talking about, extending a word. This overinflating is fundamentally both spatial and temporal. Spatial, God is understood as a central power coming from above, a highness, hence all the superpowers attributed to a God, conceived as a legislator, jealousy, arbitrariness, love, and others. Above, in Spinoza, is the most acute example of the spatial overreading of the sacred. It implies an overarching and overlooking position proceeding from a hidden and unreachable power. Temporal, in temporal sense, above means before. All prophets have seen, have heard somebody or something that was there before, already, waiting to be seen or heard. Above and before, obviously in her title for her essay, are the two main structures or patterns of sacralization. In these two structures, we recognize the very economy of superstition. That's the term she finishes with there. So the over can be understood as excess, but also in its excess as a fabulation of the spatial in terms of superstition, the god or gods above us. However, Malibu argues that superstition can be redeemed through a theory of interpretation, this notion of overinterpretation. And this also operates on superstition of the past, the before, alongside the above. Citing Emile Beneviste's work in linguistics, she notes, quote, superstitio is the, I don't know, this is a short quote, so I don't have a slide for it, sorry. Superstitio is the gift of second sight, which enables a person to know the past as if he or she had been present, superstis there. This is how superstitiosus, pardon my Latin or lack of it, denotes that gift of second sight, which is attributed to seers, that of being a witness of events at which he has not been present. For Malibu, then, has a tendency to overread, superstition is not bad per se, as she puts it. On the contrary, quote, you've got the slide there, it marks the origin of the symbolic, and in that sense, it cannot be totally separated from ideality. What he showed is that the origin of interpretation resides in overinterpretation. No need for Spinoza to refer to any transcendence in the message. Overinterpretation is, in a certain sense, immanent to the message. You could get a little bit reflexive here and say that this seems to be an overinterpretation of overinterpretation, in as much as it's the very origin of the symbolic, like that kind of huge hyperbole at the opening of the quote. That seems to be performing its own thesis, you could say. Oops, got ahead of myself. This excess, and I am going to get reflexive, but this time more about Malibu's central work as a materialist. This excess within the message can also be applied to Malibu's own work as a materialist. I just said that. Her recent book, or relatively recent book, Morphing Intelligence, can itself be perhaps overly read as imminent to the evolution of her project's ambition, which it is, which is to keep continental philosophy informed by the latest research emerging from the brain sciences. That's why she's a talking point in many continental circles at the moment. Relevance, empirical relevance even. In maintaining this acquaintance with the empirical, she has found that her own thesis, prior thesis, concerning the plasticity of our brain requires reformation, as she admits. In the preface to the text, she admits that, quote, for a long time, I believed that neuronal plasticity prescribed any comparison between the natural brain and machines, especially computers. However, the latest advantages in artificial intelligence, especially the development of synaptic chips, have mounted a serious challenge to this position, namely her position. Unquote. The need to develop her concepts and languages, her names, if you like, in particular replacing the centrality of plasticity with that of epigenesis in her latest work, can be regarded as both a drawback for any philosophy trying to maintain its currency, its relevance, through an ever-evolving scientific materialism, but also as the virtue of a thought like hers that is attempting to materialize its own performance through these covariant mutations. Epigenesis is the theory that the embryo develops progressively from an undifferentiated egg cell, that life follows a program of sort, going through a predictable sequence of events. I'll read that again with a different intonation. That life follows a program of sort, going through a predictable sequence of events tempers both her idea of the plasticity of biological forms, as well as, at least in Malibu's view, any clear distance being kept between the organic and the artificial. She charts her conversion to epigenesis as follows. Slightly longer quote. Sorry about that. Years, I explored the concept of plasticity, viewing it as the potential starting point for a new conception of freedom that would no longer be separated from the biological definition of thought and action. Isn't brain plasticity exactly this vitality of intelligence, the one that tests, measurements, and factors will never identify? Unfortunately, however, or is it fortunately, recent developments in artificial intelligence shook me out of my non-dogmatic slumber. I came to see that the conclusions I presented in What Should We Do With Our Brain, a classic short text of earlier position, were, to put it bluntly, wrong-headed. Shortly after that book came out, it became apparent to me that it needed revising, if not a complete rewrite. This suspicion, which being depressed at the time, this suspicion dawned on me upon reading an article about recent computational architectures, especially IBM's creation of an entirely new type of chip, a neurosynaptic processor, that dramatically increases processing abilities while minimizing the energy required for computation. But the title of the article, quote, IBM's neurosynaptic chip mimics human brain, unquote, was misleading. In fact, this chip is not capable of imitating synaptic functioning. It functions de facto as a synaptic connection. It is a synapse. A nice little identity statement. It is a synapse of a type, presumably. So with the zeal of a convert, the philosopher pushes further than the science, or at least the title of the article, proclaiming a real identity over a correlated function. More than that, however, Malibu's own thesis has morphed, as she would put it. As a biophilosophical hybrid of deconstructive thought and brain science, it has deconstructed itself, rendered plasticity plastic by tempering its own freedom with epigenetic predictability, programmability. As such, she asks, quote, how could we not conclude that plasticity is programmable, since it is becoming the fundamental program of cybernetics? But it is a programmable and programmed plasticity, but is a programmable and programmed plasticity still plasticity? Not that plasticity is the opposite of the concept of a program on principle. Rather, epigenetic mechanisms are programmed genetically, unquote. Now, such a renewal in language and thought on her part no doubt reflects a desire to seek out the new and extraordinary within science in order to maintain a philosophical and worldly relevance, which I mentioned at the outset. On the other hand, there is the countervailing need to renew language simply in order to think in duration, if you take it from the Bergsonian point of view. This is part of the price paid by any scientific philosophy. Indeed, the physicist Lee Smolin, in his book Time Reborn, writes with great relevance on this point. I'll get you a shorter quote for your delectation. Scientists think in time, he uses the phrasing without reference to Bergson. Scientists think in time when we conceive of our task as the invention of novel ideas to describe newly discovered phenomena, and of novel mathematical structures to express them. If we think outside time, we believe these ideas somehow existed before we invented them. If we think in time, we see no reason to presume that. Unquote. And this is exactly what Henri Bergson meant by the requirement of philosophy to think in duration. The need for it to use, as he also put it, flexible, mobile, almost fluid representations, unquote, in order to stay true to the mobility of the real. Unquote. Like Malibu, Bergson formed much of his philosophical research around empirical sciences. Matter and Memory, for example, 1896, focusing on studies of the brain in particular. Yet, as Paul Atkinson explains recently, Bergson was looking to place, quote, the brain within an ontology of perception rather than deriving a theory of perception from the operation of the brain, unquote. And that ontology was processual and immanentist. In terms of methodology, therefore, he insisted on the inevitability for any serious philosophical terminology, and he includes his own language of duration, multiplicity, and differentiation here, to lose its purchase on real process unless it too continually mutated. every new idea is eventually stripped of its suggestive power, and this is a technical term for Bergson, the suggestive power, as it slowly absorbs the more mundane thoughts linked to it by association. Philosophy must renew its language and imagery, and indeed its models of knowledge, if it is to remain vital and relevant. Now, in my own recent work, which was mentioned by, at the start on mysticism, which is also connected to spiritualism and psychical research and a whole bunch of wacko things, an attempt to integrate, reintegrate what some people will call as the paranormal, the spooky, within the ordinary or the normal through a concept, an outdated concept called the supernormal, which is not the same as the paranormal. And this attempt to re-enchant the ordinary, so to speak, is also, one could say, an attempt of renewing language, and a renewal that itself will eventually lose its way and lose its own power by coming to the end of its line and being replaced by other lines of thought. Following Bergson's lead and Malibu's recent example, therefore, philosophy always overinterprets itself eventually, extends itself too far in that way, becomes hyperbolic or vacuous. This need not be achieved only through scientific fluency, though it could be part of it. What is needed, in a sense, to keep up the renewal rather than the mere extension of one model, is the ability to create new concepts, images, and models using whatever materials come to hand. Changing names once or twice is not sufficient. The real is not comprehended simply by, as Bergson put it, giving it one name, unquote. On the contrary, because reality and logic too are essentially processual or inessential for a process philosopher like Bergson, philosophy must keep creating the right expression to fit new realities. Names need to keep multiplying. Such mutation or morphing could even act reflexively as the recursive metamorphosis of metaphysics itself. So it would be understood now as an ever-expanding perception rather than the intellectual grasp of an eternal truth. An empirical metaphysics subspecies durationis, as Bergson put it, over Spinoza's own metaphysics subspecies eternitatis. Yet such ramifications would not proceed within a disembodied logical regress of types or orders of representation, I'm going to come back to this, so much as a real progress of cosmological tiers, levels, or planes. And this is why an over-interpretation, a multiplication of names, is not the representation of one level, but the invented effects of many levels, high and low, constructively interfering with each other, I would try to argue. As above, so below, micro and macro, super and sub, over and under. These are all heterogeneous types of spatiality, operating vertically and horizontally at once. Okay, that's the end of part one. And now part two, reduction, high and low. Whenever I read that out, I think of, for those of you who certainly. Another word for taking one name, one image, or one model to stand for all others is, of course, reductionism. But again, do we know exactly what reductionism always means? In the introduction to one collection of essays on the topic, reductionist accounts were described as aiming to show that, quote, where we thought we had two sets of concepts, entities, laws, explanations, or properties, we in fact have only one, which is most perspicuously characterized in terms of the reducing vocabulary. For these writers, reduction is primarily a question of conceptual education. Another examination of the matter finds the motivation for reductive analyses to be in the contrast between concepts in one vocabulary appearing problematic and those in another avoiding the problem. An analysis, therefore, represents the incursion of concepts from the latter into those of the former. But these seemingly benign or at least neutral epistemological motives behind reductive explanations have been interpreted less positively a while back by the philosopher Robert Nozick. Seeing our times aptly represented by the title The Age of Reductionism, he viewed its prevalence as part of an increasing tendency to deflate. While it is obvious that there have always been reductionist theories, materialism in ancient Greece, for example, more recently, Nozick argues, quote, such theories have moved to the center of the intellectual stage. These views, undermining, unmasking, and denigrating people's attachments, principles, motivations, and modes of action, have now come to shape people's own view of themselves, end quote. Nozick argues that much of contemporary reductionism depends on the microscopic, non-human, and general realms of impersonal psychic forces, dumb economic laws, or invisible neurological processes. Imagine Catherine Malibu being the target there if they were contemporary. There is also talk of higher levels being derived from lower levels, high and low level. The intent is not simply to debunk the opposing explanation, but to value the realm in which that explanation resides. Devaluation or deflation is the key, a norm derived from nature that then can be extended, no doubt, inevitably to establish an ethics or even a political program. But here's the rub. Nozick, as some of you guessed anyway, was writing this critique of reductionism 40 years ago in his book, Philosophical Explanations, 1981, Plus le change, and so on. Nonetheless, it was echoed more recently by the likes of Isabel Stengers, who also writes that, quote, propositions that contain the word only are all by nature reductionist. Politics of that. Note, by the way, her use of the term nature here, are all by nature reductionist. But this nature here being a sort of philosophical version of the term. Now, scale, high, low, below, above, and so on, does seem to have a particularly important role in the latest forms of monist reductionism. The lower is often the below. Whether it is of lower or less value is another thing, but certainly some would argue in new materialism, which does value and give agency to matter, it is still a question of the micro, the lower. The notion of as below, so above. This focus on the micro, in physics to be sure, but also in biology, stem cells, cognitive science, neuroplasticity, embryonic epigenesis, as we just heard, is what Sam Coleman calls smallism. The idea that truth resides in the smallest particulars of reality, which may clump together to form larger wholes, of course. Or that, quote, the ontological truth is to be found with the small, or with all the smalls in all their innumerable multiplicity, unquote. That said, however, Platonic reductionism operates in the other direction, deriving or reducing the lower, not from the below, but from the heights of abstraction. I'm using the heights there metaphorically and literally. Abstractions being more real than mere reality. Alain Badiou's mathematicism will be a reduction of this variety. But so also would some varieties of mystic spiritualism, who employ the concept as above, so below, throughout their thinking. So instead of the micro-reductionism, or sorry, micro-materialism of so below as above, it goes the other way around. Here, though, with these certain kinds of spiritualists or mystics, it is inflationary rather than deflationary. If it is reductive, it is a derivation from the Neoplatonic one that is also an exaltation, a promotion, with an ethics and politics to match. The Hermetic orders of the Middle Ages and well into the 19th century, for instance, invoked this seemingly simple principle of covariance, as above, so below, and yet for them, this basic scalarity conceals something more sophisticated. It involved the idea that the earthly events reflect those occurring on an astral plane by means of correspondence and attunement. As one 19th century spiritualist wrote, there we go. Imagination, eidolon, means the faculty of building an image. The imagination of the artist must lie in the power, which he possesses more or less in proportion to his sincerity and his intuition, of perceiving forces in the macrocosm and allaying or attuning himself thereto, his talents naturally and his artificial training permitting him to formulate images which shall express those forces. So allaying and attuning, or allying and attuning, denotes, as I write elsewhere, or will eventually, quasi-physical images of connection. An alliance is a binding from the allegare, to bind, while an attunement is a tension or stretching, from tenine, to stretch. In each image, a material connection, binding and tensile, is formed between the micro and macro levels, a physico-spiritual amalgam that is both unifying and multi-layered. Joshua Rami, writing about the corpus hermeticum, explains its teaching that, quote, materiality and spirituality are profoundly united, unquote, with life itself being a process in which, quote, the nature of the divine is both discovered and produced in an unfolding of personal and cosmic, evolutionary and historical time. This is the meaning of as above, so below, the process of natural life as a manifestation of cosmic divinity. Now, I put the picture of the author of that earlier quotes beside. For the spiritualists who wrote about imagination and the micro was Moina Mathers, also known as Mina Bergson, a leading member of two Hermetic orders at the turn of the 20th century, and also the sister of Henri Bergson, or if you prefer, Henri Bergson's was her brother. And indeed, her use of the term intuition and imagery here is quite thought-provoking. Yes, her use of eidolon or imagination was not a gesture of unity or immersion within some whole or absolute, but one could argue, as I am trying to, not here, carries a non-philosophical sense of Gnostic knowing. That is, not something giving privileged access to the real, but the realization that the ordinary of the everyday is already immanent to the real. And that includes a kind of ordinary mysticism. Not exactly the same as Francois Laruelle's, but similar. I could go on, but I won't. What that? How are you doing with that? Yeah. In an essay by physicist Paul Halpern, wonderfully entitled Spiritual Hyperplane, we find a useful history of both old and more recent engagements by spiritualists with the science of physics. Or rather, we should say, spiritually inclined physicists. One of these can be found in the book entitled The Unseen Universe, a popular book from 1875 by mathematical physicists Balfour Stewart and Peter Guthrie Tait. It was published anonymously and for obvious reasons. As Halpern reports, it attempted to link the principle of the conservation of energy with the spiritual question of life after death. In one passage, it also connected a fourth dimension of space with an unseen realm that could be interpreted as spiritual. Halpern cites Stewart and Tait thus, quote, just as points are the terminations of lines, lines the boundaries of surfaces, and surfaces the boundaries of portions of space of three dimensions, so we may suppose our essentially three-dimensional matter to be the mere skin or boundary of an unseen whose matter has four dimensions. Shame they didn't call it dark matter. He published again in a blink of an eye. These days, here's that phrase again, these days, that's Halpern's phrase. Halpern observes that, quote, most physicists eschew any spiritual connotations of higher dimensions, of course. Though he adds that, perhaps in some cases, the mystique of the spiritual, as expressed in books such as The Dancing Woolly Masters by Gary Zukav, has helped to draw new recruits to the genuine science, physics being the genuine science. Now, earlier than Gary Zukav, who wasn't a scientist, came the work of Austrian physicist Fritjof Capra, whose 1975 book, The Tao of Physics, explains itself perfectly in its subtitle, quote, an exploration of the parallels between modern physics and Eastern mysticism. Quote. Seeing parallels between the new physics, as it was still called in the 1970s, primarily meaning quantum mechanics and relativity theory, special and general, and spirituality has, of course, become a common enough strategy in a good deal of science and humanities writing since the 1970s. It is something that Karen Barad's version of materialism in Meeting the Universe Halfway excels at in particular, despite her protests to the country of not conducting any such work in mere analogy. Where Capra gave us physics and the Tao in order to see the world anew as a highly interconnected ecology, Barad gives us physics and high theory, feminism, gender theory, post-structuralism, and post-humanism in order to think about the problems of epistemology anew as forms of entangled knowledge. Barad begins with a new conception of matter, however, one that emerges from quantum mechanics, and especially the version championed by Niels Bohr. In this approach, she says, oh, I never gave you, here we go. Come on, speed up. Right. In her approach, or Niels Bohr's approach, as appropriated by Barad, matter is neither fixed and given nor the mere end result of different processes. Matter is produced and productive, generated and generated. Matter is agentive, not a fixed essence or property of things. Mattering is differentiating, and which differences come to matter? Matter is the iterative reduction of different differences. Unquote. Quite a difficult thing to read. Barad claims that her diffractive approach, not an analogy, a compare and contrast, a diffractive approach to physics is no mere compare and contrast. Indeed, for her, that type of exercise is not really worth pursuing, or at least not anymore. Quote, she has no patience with, she says, tricks with mirrors, for example, whereby you might say the macroscopic is said to mirror the microscopic, or the social world is treated as a reflection of the metaphysics of individualism perfected in atomic theory, and so on. The drawing of analogies like that between special relativity and the Cubist school of painting, for instance, can be very interesting. That's a nice compliment, backhanded albeit. But these common modes of analysis are only of limited value and insufficient for understanding the deeper philosophical issues at stake. This diffractive methodology enables me to examine in detail important philosophical issues, such as the conditions for the possibility of objectivity, the nature of measurement, the nature of nature, and meaning making, the conditions for intelligibility, the nature of causality and identity, and the relation between discursive practices and the material world. So quite a lot then can be done in this approach. Well, I'm thinking, if you can hear the echo of Bergson saying, wow, you're going to do an awful lot with one approach. You know, that's the idea that's really going to extend. It doesn't say existence, but it's doing a lot of work. But certainly, there is no simple as above, so below, or so below as above even, operative here. Nor will readers, she adds, looking to be, quote, dazzled, entertained, and mystified by a quixotic sideshow of isolated facts and cutesy quirks of quantum theory, unquote, find any satisfaction in her work. Her approach is serious and explores, as she puts it, deeper philosophical issues. Now, Iris van der Thun is one philosopher who's taken Barad's work very seriously, and indeed sees parallels between it and Bergson's ideas. When Barad states that, quote, reality is not composed of things in themselves, thingfication, or things behind phenomena, representationalism, but things in phenomena, or when she writes of an ongoing flow of agency and a processual historicity, van der Thun sees ideas here that are, as she puts it, very much in line with Bergson, unquote. Indeed, the dynamism at the heart of Barad's view of the world is thoroughly Bergsonian in spirit if we look to Barad's writing directly. We have another quote. Material, this is not Barad, but very Bergsonian in her, if not in her metaphilosophy, certainly in her approach to physics. Materialization is not the end product of simply a succession of intermediary effects of purely discursive practices. Materiality itself is a factor in materialization. The dynamics of mattering are nonlinear. The specific nature of the material configurations of the practices of bodily production, which are themselves phenomena in the process of materializing, matters to the materialization of the specific phenomena of which they are a part, which matters to the ongoing materialization of the world in its intraactive becoming, which makes a difference in subsequent patterns of mattering, and so on. That is, matter is enfolding into itself its ongoing materialization. So matter is a process, and almost in recursive, what counts as matter is a process, what matter coming to be matter, so to speak, and mattering. So Barad's conspicuous use of the verbal form mattering and her emphasis on matter as process, materialization, is obviously evocative of Bergson too, though it's not a major influence thinker that she avows. Matter is best understood in a process of emergence for Barad, or this materialization. Quote, matter refers to the materiality stroke materialization of phenomena, not to an inherent fixed property of abstract independently existing objects of Newtonian physics. Quote. So far, so processual. Oddly enough, though, Barad's anti-foundationalist metaphysics, relations over relata, emergence of a substrate, irreducible process, and so on, is all the same as our somewhat implied clearly, founded on the truths of fundamental physics, even as it posits an epistemology and practice that is interactive or diffractive, as she puts it. In this, however, she would not be the first to practice such seeming inconsistency, and one could even argue that she must at least be paraconsistent, doing X and not doing X, given the unstable foundations of her theoretical touchstone, quantum mechanics, and its ability to practice doublethink. X is a wave and is not a wave. Francois Laruelle, for instance, would be another anti-foundationalist who turns to the quantum realm, nonetheless, for a model of knowing. And arguably of late, he's been doing so in a slightly absolutist way, but I would still regard him as a pluralist in his early work. But in each case, the defense would have to say that paraconsistency is the only consistency available. Nonetheless, this will be as odd as things go. Any similarities between the discontinuous logic of paraconsistency and, say, the irrationality of the paranormal, for instance, would have to be disavowed. Quantum matter may behave oddly, but it is still not the spooky physics of higher dimensional space investigated by the spiritualist physicists of the 19th century. Okay, we're nearly done. Conclusion then. It's called This and That. It kind of harks back to some earlier ideas. So what I'm only beginning to outline here so far is a notion of spirit. Now, I've only just touched on it, really, but to think of it as a structural placeholder rather than a thing. Or, if you like, you can call it meta-spirit. That which would refer to that which falls outside of and resists a reduction to nothing or to just one thing. Such a meta-spirit can have a multitude of names, one of which might even be matter, or understood as a tendency, meta-material. The objective of what I'm trying to do is to naturalize spirit in a way, and even matter as supernormal, that's something else, in the ordinary real. Not with one name, be it plasticity or vibrancy or even duration, but with multiple names, all pronounced equally, all the names of all the practices of the real. Now, I'm also positing this thought as an exercise in Laruellean non-standard philosophy, one that strives to expand, at least in its middle phase, the pluralist phase, what we understand by philosophical thinking by taking, in this case, mystic spiritualism as a model for thought. As an equalizing and pluralizing gesture in philosophical thought, it may well attract as many, nothing worse and nothing better than democracy, isn't there, as it will repulse so many others, because it's just a load of weird baloney, perhaps. But this notion of above and below, as below, so below, is an interesting model that you can, in a sense, abstract from a kind of substantialist metaphysics of spirit, and then think of it in that kind of structural way. But this spiritualist turn is not to be confused with a simple inversion of dominance within a matter-spirit binary that does nothing to alter its terms. What is needed, I think, and called for, is you might say, a non-Platonist model of spirit, a deflated spirit brought back down to earth, so to speak. It is one that does not entail such incompatible categories as the immaterial or the disembodied, which would only be just types of substance anyway, insubstantial substance, but involves something like an ordinary mysticism or hyperesthesia operating unnoticed. Would this not be the natural sibling to the inflated matter, as seen in the work of Malibu or Barad? Such alternative and radical concepts of spirit might be seen as complements or even alter egos to the so-called new materialisms of vibration, entanglement, and plasticity, or even epigenesis. Only when polarized as incompatible substances with spirit and matter enter a duality of antagonistic opposites, caricatures of themselves in fixed states, lumpish bodies versus unearthly specters, spooks. Spirit would not name one insubstantial substance opposed to another, substantial one. It would name one aspect of a changing relation, the heterogeneous continuity, or the features of a changing relation, one of whose relata are themselves also mutating. The meta, going back to metaphysics, the meta of metaphysics would equally no longer name that which leaves or transcends the physical world, metaphysics as cryptophysics, spooky physics, but rather that in the world which changes, change or becoming. As Zeno of Ilia might contend, Even the most pedestrian movement is a metaphysical gesture of sorts, though a false metaphysics for him. Bergson's solution to Zeno's Achilles paradox is perfectly ordinary. Achilles' steps were, quote, overtaking steps. That's it. That is how he overtook the tortoise. I take the first step, and then a second, and so on. Finally, after a certain number of steps, I take the last one, by which I skip ahead of the tortoise. It's that easy. It seems too easy. But it's like G.E. Moore's proof of an external world. He holds up his two hands, gestures with each hand to the other while saying, here is one hand, and here is another. The ordinary bodily gesture carries within it, therefore, you could argue, a non-Platonist metaphysics. At an even more meta-theoretical level, perhaps, without this meta implying a logic of higher order representation, by the way, we can say that matter is simply this and spirit that, two gestural demonstratives, literally and figuratively. These gestures are the minimal dyad, be it of substance, property, or even direction of process, and all that matters is that they be mutually irreducible so that we can explain why the real does not appear as just one thing, even if only in virtue of the illusion or hallucination of at least two things, because then we have the illusion and non-illusion, two things, spirit and matter, manifest and scientific, living and dead, or just illusion and reality, so forth. There's always the dual aspect, the double life. The names are unimportant, but the demonstrability is showing this and that by giving each a name. Naturalisms are rarely, you could argue, naturalistic enough then, and need to be not just correlational, but hypercorrelational, hyperparallel, with psychophysical parallels going all the way up and down, in and out, above and below. So to say that everything is X, an old or modern arche, that everything is matter, or everything is spirit, or différance, or durée, is ultimately vacuous. But there is always the real illusion, there is always the real illusion of at least two. You could say that this illusion itself is an illusion, but I wouldn't if I were you. Conversely, for a pluralism that says everything is many, which is what pluralism does, its own formula must be recursive in order to avoid a monism of substance, you could argue, a static nomination. Because it's saying everything is, and then it's putting in an X, and the X is many. It too must continually reperform itself anew with novel formulations and names, indefinitely, I would say. This performance of new names and new ways of naming, many of them perhaps non-linguistic, gestural, demonstrative, simply is the ramification of types, both cosmical and logical at once. Indeed, there are other different recursive logics of expression. Logics based on objects which are not simply taken as mutually exclusive solids. At times they can be this and that, but not at all times. There is a need for different logics that are for and from different kinds of things. I believe that Laruelle's and Bergson's democratic non-philosophies, their revisionary metaphysics, so to speak, though Laruelle would never use that term, are attempts to practice just this type of thinking about just these kinds of things. And that's it. Thank you very much. Was the sound off? The sound was off in the last half hour or something.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for a very interesting and very dense lecture.
Oh dear. Okay, I pitched it too densely, did I? But never mind. There's a book which will be the expanded view.
Yes. I don't see in the chat as of now any questions. And perhaps it would be good if you would stop sharing the screen, then I can see more of the windows in the conversation.
You're sharing the screen, and then I stop share, yeah.
Yes, very good. Okay, the floor is open. Who has the first question?
Shall I just start?
No, hello, Iris.
Yes, Iris.
Hi, okay.
Only people mentioned in the paper are allowed to ask questions.
Well, thank you for the reference indeed. So I wanted to ask you, and thank you for the paper, of course. So I wanted to ask you about this larger project, because I saw many kind of hooks, let's say, maybe refer to things that I'm working on, sometimes also very much with artists, so really practicing artists that have a renewed interest, I think, in spirituality and mysticism at this point. So I have never provided so many references to the last chapter of the two sources of Bergson as, just in the last 2 months or something. So, I wonder whether that is also something you notice, but, in order to actually have this conversation, I would like to know a little bit more about this, the larger context of your project and what the specific interests are. And then before you say that, I want to thank you for the reference to the Malabou text, because we keep on referring to this one sentence by Williams about, nature is one of the most complicated terms in the language. He says exactly the same thing about culture. So when you read the entry on culture, it starts exactly the same. And I think you made that bridge really quite beautifully, I think, through this specific Malabou text. So these are just a few thoughts.
Okay, no, thank you, Iris. So yes, this is part of a larger project response, but you asked. So, well, kind of the inspiration for it was basically, on the one hand, those of you. So, like my own training is a mix. My original own training is a mix of continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. And generally, analytic philosophy regards itself as hard-nosed, uses words like rigor and robust, in a way that used to be parodied by Lyotard in the 70s and 80s. It's doing something serious. And continental philosophy was interesting, but nonetheless, mostly literature and artistic expression. And a lot of this changed in the 90s, I would say. And whereas analytic philosophers started to read Sartre, who they would previously have despised, as an interesting philosopher of mind, for instance. Mark Rowlands does that kind of work. Meanwhile, continental philosophers are starting to read a bit more of analytic thinking about language and science and so on and so forth. Continental understood as the kind of Anglophone reception of mostly Franco-German thought. I'm not talking about per se what's happening in France and Germany, but the kind of Anglophone reception of it, which is a bit parochial as a way to start. But I've always been interested in the way in which, if you're interested in Bergson, 20 or 30 years ago, you're regarded by somebody who's a Kantian as a kind of new age philosopher. What's the point of bothering with you? And you would be defensive, and you'd say something like, well, he's got really interesting things as an externalist model of mind, or he's an ultra realist of perception. And you say these things in order to get past so what's the élan vital then? Some sort of mystic force that runs throughout matter. It's a bit like Star Wars, isn't it? Etc. So, but then I thought, well, instead of being defensive, there's one thing about Bergson I wanted to look into, and that is namely his sister. So the Bergson family are a very interesting family, and very little has been written about their relationship. They're not French for a start, really. They are Anglo-Irish, Polish-Jewish. There's not a drop of French blood in Henri Bergson or any of the Bergson family. He happened to be born in Paris and was naturalized, as the rest of the family then went back to Britain, England. But then, in the 1890s, his sister, who had become a spiritualist with her husband, a founder of a Hermetic order of, Alpha A Omega, a spin-off of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they came back to Paris. And she was practicing and writing mystic instruction manuals for training people, but also doing rites of Isis and all this kind of stuff. And in the rites of Isis, as she performs it, you get this kind of invocation of the past, a kind of a deity through her material performance, her bodily performance is invoked in movements and gesture. Okay. And okay, that's wacko and as new age as it comes, perhaps. But what's interesting is that now there is this kind of sober reading of Bergson, 20 or 30 years later. There's a kind of reading of Bergson who's a very interesting view of the ultra-realist image understanding of the past. That namely, that it's not simply that the past is a representation, but the past is immanent. The past somehow survives. And when we remember, there is, in a sense, the revivification, or not even revivification, simply the actualization of something that never left. So there's a continuity of time, and so on and so forth. So in a way, he was writing and giving lectures in the 1890s and then 1900 on the Collège de France on a kind of metaphysics of time travel. What seems to be mental time travel, but for him it actually has an ontological basis to a degree. Meanwhile, his sister is practicing this stuff at another kind of level, but also writing about it. There's not much out there, but you can sort of construct kind of concordance, if you like, covariance of ideas between the two that I think informs each other nicely. So basically, I've written this book on a kind of Bergsonism that is neither Henri's nor Mina Bergson's, but it brings up a kind of notion of mysticism, or ordinary mysticism, as Laruelle would put it, of time travel, which is neither merely mental time travel, nor something whereby you get into a DeLorean car and through some objective scientific method go back to 1953 or anything like that. Something in between the two. And through looking at their works and how their use of diagrams, their use of imagery, he talks about the virtual, of course, she would talk about the astral, and all sorts of things. You can create this interesting set of covariances. And in order not to shy away anymore of the adage of being a new age philosopher, so to speak, and also to remind myself of just when I first read Matter and Memory years and years ago, how very weird that book appeared to be. Written in the 1890s, at the same time as his sister arrived in Paris. I'm not saying we have no record that she influenced him or vice versa, but they lived about 10 minutes walk away from each other in Paris all through the 1890s. And he wrote his strangest book. Everyone agrees it's both his hardest book and his strangest book in many ways. It fits into a kind of Bergsonian way of thinking in terms of duration and so on, like creative evolution or time for real, but it also stands alone. It's odd in other ways. Particular chapters are just odd and not like the rest of his works. And with that kind of suggestive, way of beginning, I've constructed this project. And that's the long-winded answer. Sorry.
Thanks so much.
Okay, we had Jaron Wolf. You had a question before.
Yeah, that's just true.
Hi, John. How are you? Good to see you.
Hello.
Thank you for the talk. I feel like we have lots of things to discuss at some later point about Bergson in general, but I thank you for the talk, first of all, and also the comments about his sister are really interesting. I have things I'll look into. And I agree with the comments about matter and memory being very difficult. With each read, it seems to get a bit, maybe even more.
Yes. And even within itself, it's got the first two chapters, and then the three, and then etc. It kind of undulates in its strangeness as well. It's different in different, like two different books fighting with each other.
That's true. So I wanted to ask about reductionism in relation to Bergson in particular. So I kind of picked up the idea that you might think that Bergson is a sort of reductionist in some way because he thinks that everything is durée in a sense, or it's a kind of reductionism that's maybe not materialistic but reduces everything to durée.
No, well, obviously, as it was obviously, I delivered it too rapidly. Reductionism. If one understands reductionism, be it a kind of inflationary or deflationary, as in high Platonist, everything is just a copy of an abstraction, or something more tangible, materialist, smallism, visit small little things, etc. Coleman puts it. No, either way, if they are reducing it to a name, as Bergson will put it, call it mechanism or will, it is just one thing, and what that would become. By its extension, it would become vacuous. It becomes synonymous with existence. And then we are back to, in a sense, trying to save the appearances. The appearance of, as he puts it, spontaneity against inertia, or in other words, life, living matter, as opposed to inert matter. It may be that ultimately he's not a he's not a hylozoist per se. He kind of, but there are people who read him as a panpsychist, as a kind of sort of the modern respectable version of that thesis. But even though there is that, in a sense, philosophical position of panpsychism, which you can attribute to Bergson, even then, that would, I think, go against his idea of thinking in duration. That the concepts themselves, so it's metaphilosophical, but understood as not philosophy as a representation of the real, philosophy as an aspect, a part whole aspect, a mereological aspect, as he thinks of thought itself and imagination and so on, as not representations, but mereological parts. Philosophy too is a part, it too proceeds. And in this, that's why, of course, he's famously, didn't famously say, but says that metaphors are the most, and certain kinds of images are the most precise way of capturing a fluid reality. You have to speak in this fluid way in order to try and not so much capture or represent, but instantiate the fluidity of the mobile real. So I would say that for him, in a sense, the processual thinking, or thinking in duration, has to be one that mutates. And that's why there is the inconsistency in his thinking. So-called inconsistency is the only kind of consistency you can have in an inconsistent universe in that way. So I certainly no, I don't think he's reductionist as in reducing it to the one. But if he does, if as a pluralist or a processual say everything is change or everything is movement, but then what is movement and change as they're represented, or written about, I should say, or performed even, in his different texts change. Like we have words, and of course we have his whole critique of language. One word for love or whatever, sadness, covers over a whole set of a panoply, a multitude of states. And likewise, his own language, the kind of key words that we have to use when we're explaining and teaching Bergson, those words are implemented and have a different coloring to them in their different texts. And in a sense, as Yankelevich wrote himself, that the best way to represent Bergson is, or be Bergsonian, is to kind of keep on mutating subsequently, rather than kind of to nail it down in some clear and distinct way.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess it's something I'm still struggling with.
It's good. Yeah, you're not going to unstruggle. it's I've been at it a while now, and it's still very difficult and unsatisfying and painful, actually, as he talks about in the first edition of the earlier editions, or is it the French versus the English? I forgot. Anyway, of Introduction to Metaphysics, he literally talks about this being it's a painful exercise of thinking, and hence, other philosophers have an easy old time of it doing their stuff, but we Bergsonians have the hardest job. It is literally a type of mental suffering to try and think backwards against the habitual modes of thought.
Perhaps I can add a question, and then Davor Löffler. So I understood your manifold critiques on gestures of what you called inflationism or reduction, but then I cannot really grasp what you mean when you say that your own project, so not your discourse critique, but your own project is about a naturalization or of spirit. What do you mean with naturalization? What does that entail?
I said I didn't want to use the word ordinaryization because that's a horrible word. But in the practice of a kind of, so Francois Laruelle is kind of in the background here as a kind of my methodology, if that's the right word. And so it's trying to make it ordinary in the sense of, so for instance, if you think of recollection as a mental representation of the past, memory, for instance, or forgetting, dementia, as another, different types of mental time travel. You think of that as mental representation, and that can be fraught also with notions of hallucination and illusion and so on and so on. And you have naturalistic theories. I was going to put in some material about naturalism regarding illusion and hallucination. But if you take it within the immanentist, an immanent paradigm where everything belongs to the real, and it's just, and then it's a question of how they differently participate in the real, and what do we mean by participate, part whole, and what does a part mean? That's kind of spatial logic. It gets a little bit murky. But if you think of it in an immanentist paradigm, then mental time travel is as good a time travel as you're ever going to get in this respect. And that is a way of, you might say, naturalizing it. Obviously keeping in your mind that the word nature, hence the Raymond Williams classic quote, is a contested term, and it can mean a whole bunch of things. It can mean normal, habitual. It can mean something about the natural sciences. It can mean something about materialism or physicalism, what the certain sciences say matter is all about, and so on and so forth. But it's not to say that naturalism of mental time travel makes every recollection, in a sense, real time travel, because nature has been defined and we know what naturalism is. What it is to create a kind of indefinition of meaning. And this is a term Bergson uses throughout. It's not a key word, indefinite, but he uses it throughout his work, nearly as much as the word virtual, in actual fact. But the Deleuzians is going, oh, virtual is a key term. The notion of the indefinite, which is neither definite, neither finite or infinite, for instance, and has both a spatial and temporal quality to it, and also an epistemological quality. And this is one way in which, for instance, lately I've attended a kind of online Bergson conference and a very good paper on the élan vital as not a positive substance. It's not some sort of spooky fluid or anything like that, or energy form, etc. It is, in a sense, a kind of, you might call it an epistemological remedy to thinking we know what life is, an indefinition of what life is. But this epistemology isn't simply methodological. It is actually, within an immanentist paradigm, it's actually part of the real. Indefinition is both the real ambiguity, if you like, of the real, to sound like Merleau-Ponty, but also a practice. You're practicing the élan vital by using an indefinite image of what life is. As soon as you start to or attempt to hammer down a defined image of what life is as whatever, X, Y, or Z, then in a sense, for metaphilosophical reasons, which are not representational, I think, according to Bergson, you're actually betraying it. That is actually creating a kind of immanent illusion. You would not say, actually, that you would say. I've just said it. Laruelle would say it. Okay. I've not convinced you. But
but it helped a lot to clarify that you think of the natural as the ordinary. So this
I wasn't aiming for clarity anyway, so that's okay.
So we have Davor Löffler with a question, and then Martin Rosenberg, and I am keeping track in the chat, so of the names that are coming up next. And please just give me a sign if you have a question. Davor. We can't hear you yet.
Yeah, somebody's not on mute. Oh, are we reading it? Am I reading out, or is somebody just not muted? Unmuted?
No, we can't. I can't hear Davor. Can you?
Davor Löffler, they are. Yeah, I do that. Speak up. He's on.
But now it's coming, I think. Do you want to type it in the chat? Then I can read it for you.
Move on to the next question.
Oh, now it goes. Now it
works. Okay. So I don't know what's okay. Sorry, it's yeah, spirits. So thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask a small question for clarification. I've been taking notes, and my last note is that you said something towards the end I believe we need different logics for different kinds of things. Do you remember to having said something like this?
Yeah, I did say something along those lines.
Okay. So I believe we need different logics for different kinds of things. Could you explicate that a little bit? What does it mean, different logics? And what are different kinds of things? And who is deciding upon when to use which logic for which thing and so on?
Right. Okay. So, well, an instance of it would be, for instance, to think in terms of fluid. Basically, that's the kind of classic one, the fluid imagery. Now, this is to take fluidity, you might say, at a phenomenal or phenomenological, maybe at best level, as a given, mythic or otherwise. Rather than, oh, but a fluid is, and I've got some kind of call it mechanical explanation or physical explanation of what a fluid is. That's it. So the phenomenon of fluidity or gas actually would be another one Bergson mentions. He also mentions electromagnetic radiation as well as a possible other logics of that have a different sense of temporality and physical media which embody different forms of space and time, occupying space, for instance. So the simplest answer is basically a logic which is predicated on bivalency, you're either X or you're Y, is a solid logic of things which can only occupy one space and time or another, rather than be exist in the same thing, the same place, coexistent, for instance, in two different places, something like that. As some stick priests do on their line when they're down. But in terms of fluid logics or gaseous logic and so on and so forth, you can also think of Graham Priest's notion of paraconsistent logic, for instance, something which is both is and is not, and so on. Whereas Graham Priest kind of uses a little bit of Hegel and that kind of philosophical thinking, and he writes about in a more metaphilosophical voice about paraconsistent logic. Bergson, who is no logician, though he was quite well acquainted with math, is thinking more about the way in which our language and conceptuality is modeled on physical bodies. And for the most part, our hard logic and its classical Aristotelian principles, bivalence and all the rest of it, are modeled on inert solid objects, whereas a different sense of, a different type of materiality, if you like, would have immanent with it a different kind of thing. So you can think about Irigaray fluid mechanics, for instance, back in the 70s, albeit that people like Sokal and so on have said, what a lot of nonsense she was writing. But Bergson would give her more time. Yeah.
Okay, but how do you know then when to choose which logic?
It wouldn't, I don't think there would be a hard and fast answer to which and when. In as much as is there a kind of table and ding, 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 ding. Everything in this sense, then everything, it's not as if, well, could you derive judgment? We get into how would you judge whether somebody is using the right or wrong logic in explaining something? Ultimately, the simplest answer Bergson has, that's written throughout, is that if we start thinking about life in terms of inert material systems, closed-off systems, then we are making a kind of category error. We are using the wrong kind of logic for a vital moving phenomenon, for instance. At a more subtle, nuanced level, and then in the very way in which we attend the world, our attention span, or attention to life, as he puts it, which has got to do with an experience of duration that itself takes effort and so on, that would bring with it a different kind of perception, aesthetics, and language even. That would be, in a sense, appropriate or adequate, if you want to sound like a Spinozist, to the phenomena at the time. But certainly the kind of hard body logic is perfectly appropriate to hard bodies, for instance, of discrete inner closed up systems.
Okay, so you're saying, because otherwise you would need a universal standpoint, right? You would have to understand all things and so on, and then choose, now we have these things.
No, there's no view from nowhere in all of this. It's always a view from somewhere.
Okay,
But
so
somewheres and the sometimes themselves are plastic and elastic, but there is never, even the cosmos itself is enduring, as he puts it, is durational.
okay.
So the laws of physics themselves or change, mutate.
But and can we then even decide, or are we just thrown into this flux?
I would say he's more of a thrown into this flux, yes. Okay. So the question of how can you then, this is something Badiou says, interestingly, in various points when he's attacking Deleuze, his close friend. He says the best way, the only way to understand and theorize flux or becoming or process is from an eternalist standpoint, from an immobile standpoint, and hence he's a Platonist. Whereas Bergson, in a sense, embraces the regress, that a theory, as I was trying to say, a theory of everything, all theories of everything, which is an all theory, are themselves erroneous, is itself a kind of standpoint. But if you look at it immanently as a practice, in the sense of what it's doing, you could use it as, you could analyze it from a speech act point of view, I suppose, but I prefer to think of it as a kind of performative thing, that itself performs its thesis of duration and mutation and evolving all the time, which is irritating. You could just say he's sloppy and, you know, inconsistent and hazy and he doesn't know what he's doing. But I think I would give him the benefit of the doubt that he's actually practicing something interesting by continually evolving his statements, which appear to be at any one time, of course, if you just take them at face value, from a view from nowhere.
Okay, so there is only situated knowledge, basically.
And that is one kind of language you could use that. Yeah, situated, maybe, etc.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Good. Martin, you had a comment and a question.
John,
Hi, Martin.
I really enjoyed your talk. I'm very sympathetic to the blurring of the boundary between matter and spirit. I noticed that there are certain terms here that maybe weren't explicit in your talk, but perhaps could be brought into it, like immanence and parallelism. I've been embarking on a similar trajectory, but working backwards from Prigogine.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Prigogine back through Bergson to Maimon, and then emerging from Maimon, a genealogy of intuitionist mathematics, which is a phenomenology of the continuum, which is one source for how we understand immanence, but also going back to Spinoza and seeing in his theory of modes and attributes and substance as precursors to the project you're posing. And one source for Spinoza, who you know Bergson actually taught seminars on when he started his college teaching career, and which also connects to his sister and to Mather, is Isaac Luria, which was one of the figures translated by Mather in his Kabbalah Denude. So I'm wondering.
Mather was Mina's bird.
Yeah. So the question of immanence and emergence, and specifically a bifurcation or individuation, and this notion of parallelism. And I've been writing about jazz, specifically using these terms in order to explain what the difference is between the striations of classical music versus the smooth space of jazz improvisation. Has Luria been a figure for you? I mean, are you?
That'd be too. I'm just looking at within the Bergson family, so to speak, because I'll leave that to you. Other people have to, to fill in the bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, so the question is do you see all these figures? I mean, and I'm mentioning, Luria, Spinoza, Maimon, the mathematician Kronecker, Brouwer, the intuitionist, who was very much invested in mysticism, as he talked about the phenomenology of the continuum, and their influence, I mean, their connections to Bergson, and certainly underlying Prigoghine's project, which is an attempt to create empirical evidence for some of these notions.
I would.
Are you working? I mean, do you see this as working out of a separate ontotheology, which might not make the distinction between spirit and matter in the way that has dominated Western philosophy?
So, well, I'm just working for my little corner of the world out, so to speak. So, yes, when I've written on Bergson, it's mostly within a kind of philosophical set of problematics: time, mind-body problem, philosophy of biology, that kind of thing. Right. But there was always, as I said, this kind of, on the one hand, the constant idea that this is not proper philosophy. There's not enough Kant or Hegel or what have you, is the flavor of the decade, in it, therefore. But as Bergson has become more respectable and genuinely interesting and engaging work has been done on Bergson, I'm kind of returning to little gaps, as in, well, what was going on here or what was going on there? And this thing about his sister always just fascinated me. Now, you might say that every continental philosopher is a kind of closet mystic anyway. That's what many an analytic philosopher would probably say as well, even as they kind of wave the flag of immanence and the rest of it. I don't think that's true, but it's a kind of concern. So I thought I'd kind of face it on, but that doesn't mean I am an expert in any way on the history or posing as learned in the history of Western esotericism. I'm just writing as much as I can. I'm catching up. The history of Western esotericism is huge, and it's in the last 20 or 30 years as a discipline has blossomed. Yeah. And there's an awful lot of work being done on it. And I'm kind of looking and using what I can to fill in the gaps and publishing in certain areas in that way. But yes, I'm still, trained in philosophy and a certain branch of philosophy, even at that. And I will kind of make these references and know more as much as I can, and look to various archives to find what I can about Mina Bergson and her entourage and the work around her. And looking at parallels, you used the word parallel, interesting parallels or covariances, you might call it, between her work and her brother's, in order to, in a sense, cast different light, not to kind of make one-to-one connections, but to kind of cast a certain, cast a new way of thinking about what was going on in both of their work. It's kind of reciprocal indetermination, you might call it, a reciprocal indetermination of what was going on with her work and his work, and the notion of what is Bergsonian philosophy. So throughout,
could I make a parenthesis here? For example, we were talking about the persistence of the past in the present. Yeah. If you remember how intuitionism becomes a thing, Maimon switches from the differential to relations, and that's a really important moment, particularly for someone like Deleuze. but what Kronecker picks up is the notion that mathematics can be thought of much like nature and philosophy, but separate. And what he talks about is how a continuum emerges from one mathematical object to the emergence of the next mathematical object. And that continuum emerges from the relations that occur among the mathematical objects.
Mhm.
And this becomes, in Brouwer, an continuum. And that continuum becomes eventually the basis of all mathematics from that perspective. And it's been much more influential as a concept, even though it has remained in a backwater of mathematics. But what I'm getting at is that there's a connection between this notion of a continuum and the notion of a phenomenological immanence. And in fact, Kronecker was Husserl's teacher in mathematics, and Husserl was a major influence on Brouwer. So this notion of a continuum as a pivot between so above as below, or between physics, the physics of continuum, which we might suggest is represented by phase space, versus the phenomenological continuum, which has been a really fruitful concept for my explaining how jazz happens. So in other words, what I'm wondering is immanence the crucial concept for you in establishing the parallelism between, for example, Bergson and his sister? Might that be?
Yes, is the short answer.
Okay. Okay. Anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, man.
Who has another question or comment? I would like to pick something up from the discussion so far.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then I would, something that I was wondering, it might be another stupid sounding question, but you so casually equated will and mechanism in the beginning to treat them equally. Can you elaborate a little how you mean this?
Well, I'm quoting Bergson, so I'll just blame him. He was just saying it
Well, how you mean
it could have been, say, everything is water, everything is fire, everything is difference, everything is power. It does use the word power as well. Are themselves these, in a sense, all-encompassing explanations. That, in as much as they are all-encompassing, they lose the, if you want to call it, phenomenal differences between things which don't look like power. So the things that look like power, and in a sense, are the, I wouldn't say original, but they are significant reference for the use of a word. So if you're going to say something is will, or everything is different, and so on, presumably you have some sort of model. It might be based on human psychology. If it's difference, it might be based on a certain branch of linguistics, for instance, semiotics, etc. And that model then is expanded. Suddenly, everything can be explained in those terms, even things that don't appear to belong to that model or to be adequately explained by that model. But then it'll be said, well, but beneath the appearances, everything really is different. So just as the things that do look different and do look like they are pure power or pure will or mechanism, etc. There are the other things that appear different, but they ultimately are. You can reduce them down in that way. So it's for Bergson, you still need to save the appearances. So it's the question of, in a sense, if you want to call it ontology, the being of the illusion is, in a sense, stands out. Now, you could have an explanation of an illusion, how something other than what it is it's, derived. But that creates the original dyad, if you like, the need for a duality of thinking that I was talking about. So I was using that quote just to get up a kind of broaden out against a kind of any type of, if you like, epistemic monism, that everything boils down to one concept. One concept can explain everything. So it could be mechanism, could be will, could have been power, could have been love, could have been life even.
So then, would you describe your way of being analytical in your philosophy as being very algebraic? So because you're treating the terms like substitute placeholder terms for a kind of a structure where I'm still trying to get a picture of. Is that your self-understanding of it?
I use the word structure placeholder, yes. But the notion of a structure, what is a structure, is another interesting question. That has multiple meanings. So you could have a notion of law, you could have a notion of code, you could have build it around linguistics. You could have also a kind of comportmental notion of structure, or affective, like Michel Henri has a kind of affective structuralism, that there are basic affects that, and his is in a kind of strange immanent theology of God as life living itself through the particular affects of living beings, humans in particular. Like arguably there's a kind of pantheistic strain of Michel Henri's phenomenology of life. And these are affective structures rather than abstract quasi-mathematical codes or laws or anything like that. And the notion of posture is an important one in Laruelle, for instance. That could also be understood as a kind of embodied structure rather than some intellectual, more Platonist notion of code or mathematical notion of algebra. Although lately Laruelle does talk about algebra in his later work.
But then that means so for you, algebra and structure are equivalent, the way that you explain now.
No, I was trying to make the notion of structure indefinite by giving multiple different ways of reading the notion of structure. Bodily, affective, algebraic, if you like, mathematical, and so on and so on. Not opting for any one of them, but by keeping them shifting in a sense. So the notion of even a placeholder itself, if place would itself have to be non-spatial idea, if to kind of keep to the spirit of Bergsonism, I would say.
Who would like to follow up? Yes, Dimitar.
Hello, I would like to ask a more general question. In your opinion, to what extent should metaphysics and metaspiritual rely on laws on physics and other natural sciences when describing the world?
Metaphysics and what was the second one?
Metaspiritual.
Metaspiritual. Oh, right. You know what I talked about.
That was the topic, right?
Yes, exactly. Brilliant. I wasn't listening to my own paper, obviously, but how much should they rely on? I wouldn't give it a quant. They can't ignore them, but in order to, not to suture them, as Badiou would say, to any one form of experience, as it forms, a kind of, if you want to call it, radical empiricism or superior empiricism, maybe William James, what have you, radical empiricism. There are different kinds of experience. The mystical experience is one. It's not to be discounted as, always and ever a set of hallucinations or intoxications. And of course, you can have a brain correlation to what's going on in the mystic's brain, just as you can for lots of experiences. And that's not necessarily an elimination of it. It just makes the brain more interesting, what the hell is going on inside the brain. But in terms of the sciences, life sciences, hard physical sciences, social sciences, and so on and so forth. Like Bergson engaged with every one of them, psychology as well, anthropology, and so on. All of them, even psychical research, giving rise to sets of, as he would say, facts that need to be explained, and usually in a very broad paradigm. So how much, if you tether yourself or suture yourself to only one, as in, well, I only ever take my whatever ideas from whatever the latest physics says, which would be, interesting position, and come out with lots of interesting ideas about whatever the latest physics says about dark matter or the composition of the universe and so on. And that, I think, from a Bergsonian point of view, would be a rather narrow way of doing one's empiricism. So you've got to have a really broad notion of what counts as experience in one's empiricism.
Okay, thank you for the answer.
No,
I would also one short comment that especially physics, a lot of things constantly change in physics, especially in astrophysics. So there is, how you can say, a gray area where many scientists aren't sure what has been proven, what is right, what is wrong.
Oh yeah, there's lots of interesting theories. As I said, like I've mentioned Fritjof Capra there as a kind of prefiguring of creating parallels, and he was an Austrian physicist, is an Austrian physicist, doing interesting parallels between Taoism and physics, and in a kind of what's now become a kind of cliche of New Age mind, body, spirit thinking. But there's still interesting exercises that can deepen that, and people like Karen Barad, who are as much, she's a trained physicist, and she's bringing to bear her knowledge of physics alongside a whole set of, if you like, Western theoretical movements in gender theory and performance theory, in post-humanism, a different language than Fritjof's Capra's appropriation of Eastern thinking. So he's kind of sticking to, if you like, sticking with Western high theory in her approach, which is another interesting parallel. But nonetheless, she kind of does have a kind of, she speaks with the authority of a physicist at first, I think, to a degree. Whereas Bergson is always a mere philosopher in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask one more question, please?
Yes.
Oh, okay, just for fun. In your system or in your proposal, what is truth in it? Or what function? What function has it? So
what function?
I mean, it must have some. If you think about, if we define truth of some sort of identity function or something like this, let's say,
correspondence.
Correspondence. Then, but if you have this constant flux, then this correspondence must have some sort of both external and internal function for the things that are in flux, so to speak. I don't know if this is quite clear, at all clear what I'm trying to say. Anyway, if you can elaborate a little bit on the concept of truth in this concept, then would be nice.
In as much as an all-encompassing statement about what everything is will obviously have kind of Russell-style logical paradoxes and regresses. You can get out of that by having a regress of different types of representation, different types of statement about how things are, and then how are things about the statements about how things are, and so on and so forth. And regard those, as I kind of mentioned, as higher orders of representation. But you could also think of these higher orders as not merely, in a sense, abstract in a kind of classical logical way, but also somewhere embodied as movement within thinking at different levels, and therefore cosmological or physicalized somewhere, such that regress is not such a bad thing, so to speak. Regress is a kind of way of accessing, in one mode of thought, different levels. And the language of levels and planes, of course, is another controversial spatial effect. But there's a lovely book by George Morelos called Bergson and the Levels of Reality, which is still my favorite book. Deleuze does, and he really shows how the notion of level, niveau, is inherent in Bergson, that there are different levels of everything. And you can say there's a regress of levels, and that would also be for an immanentist approach like this, where the explanation itself is themselves in like this sort of snake swallowing itself, implicated in its own reference. That leads to a regress. And the only way out of it is to have a higher order type of, it is operating in a higher order. And I think for Bergson, given everything else he says about time and time within different planes and movements of time, and the whole regressive, the A series, if you know what I'm talking about, in time notion of there has to be a super order of time and so on and so forth. And for some people, that means it's a regress and bang, bang, that's out. For others, it means, no, there's just an infinite number of planes. Turtles all the way down, or turtles all the way up, if you like. But in an immanentist approach to epistemology, then the notion of truth is also stratified, if you like, in a regress, an infinite or indefinite, I shouldn't say infinite, indefinite regress of so-called representations, but they actually could be understood as embodied, as movement, different kinds of movement.
Okay, I will listen to that one more time later. Okay.
I always say it fast enough so it doesn't make any, makes a slightly plausibility because I sound like I believe it too. If I listen to it back, I'll be scratching my head again. I'm getting at something.
Great. So that, I think, was a good keynote. We had a wonderful and an intense evening. The lecture is going to stay on YouTube, so we can indeed watch it in different paces at later points in time. I would, at this point, also like to introduce actually our next speaker who is here, Anne-Françoise Schmidt. She's going to be our guest on the 26th, which is in 2 days from now. And to thank especially John very much for talking to us and for
all the questions and everyone attending.
Thank you all. Have a nice evening.
Yes, get some food.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Lon.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, John.